Randy the Natural Couture, Fedor the Last Emperor Emelianenko. Whilst many young MMA fans may be unfamiliar with their best work, throughout the early 2000s they became arguably the most recognisable names in the business, as well as pioneers who implemented game-changing techniques to advance the sport. Given Fedor's recent retirement, this is a fitting time to discuss a mega fight between the two that was often called for but never materialised. Randy Couture started his career in the heavyweight division, winning and defending the UFC title on multiple occasions. His elite Greco-Roman wrestling background allowed him to take down and grind down his early opponents as he pioneered dirty boxing from the clinch. Consecutive TKO losses to naturally larger foes in Josh Barnett and Rico Rodriguez in 2002 forced him to rethink his future. He opted to drop down to light heavyweight, and in 2003, at an age where most fighters would have long since retired, the 40-year-old Couture defied the odds and defeated Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz to become the first two-weight division champion in UFC history. Couture stayed in the light heavyweight division until 2006 before announcing his retirement after losing his trilogy against Liddell. Astonishingly, in 2007, Couture came out of retirement to challenge the heavyweight champion Tim Sylvia. Typical of his career to date, the Natural overcame the odds to win by a unanimous decision and become the oldest ever UFC champion at the age of 43. Given his heroic feats, at this point, Couture was arguably the brightest star in the company. Meanwhile, a young Fedor Emelianenko was refining his craft on the other side of the globe in Japan. Emelianenko used his judo and sambo background to compile an impressive 10-1 record in the Rings organization between 2000 and 2002. It wasn't long before Pride FC came knocking and Fedor joined their heavyweight roster in 2002. It was in Pride FC where Fedor's true potential was unleashed. The Rings organization rules prohibited fighters from punching to the head of grounded opponents. Pride FC did not impose such restrictions. Punching to the head was within the rules, as well as soccer kicks to downed opponents. Fedor would take full advantage of this expanded rule set and change the face of ground and pound forever. Emelianenko earned the title shot in his third fight against the Brazilian champion Antonio Minotauro Rogério Nogueira. Despite his underdog status heading into the fight, the steely-eyed Russian shocked the world by violently thrashing Nogueira for 20 minutes en route to a unanimous decision victory. This landmark victory signalled the start of a title reign of terror that would span the next 5 years, adding legends like Mirko Cro Cop, Kevin Randleman, Mark Coleman and Mark Hunt to his list of victims during this period. 2007 would prove to be a pivotal year for both men. Pride FC was suddenly forced to put their business up for sale when they lost their biggest TV deal and revenue stream. The only company who could buy them at the time were the UFC, and they subsequently obliged, paying $65 million for their rivals. Within months, the UFC had dissolved Pride FC, but the deal allowed them to acquire much of the Japanese promotion's top talent. Stars like Nogueira, Cro Cop, Shogun Rua, Rampage Jackson and Dan Henderson became UFC employees overnight. However, The Last Emperor was the remaining jewel in the crown, one which Dana White and the Fertitta brothers desperately wanted but could not obtain. At the time, Fedor had an aura of invincibility with a 26-fight win streak. The sticking point in the negotiation was exclusivity. The UFC wanted Fedor to compete only for them, whilst Fedor wanted the freedom to compete in other organisations and combat Sambo. Neither party would yield, and this resulted in an unbreakable deadlock. In what would be a major oversight by the UFC, Couture discovered that Fedor was offered a sign-on bonus that was more than he had ever been paid for a fight. Randy took this as a personal affront, referring to Fedor's terms as a slap in the face. After defending his title against Gabriel Gonzaga, he resigned from the UFC in late 2007. Whilst Couture did return in late 2008 for a blockbuster fight against Brock Lesnar, there was a 15-month window where the fight with Fedor could have happened. And at the time, there was huge public interest in the contest. It would be safe to assume that a fight between the two heavyweight legends in 2008 would have generated massive pay-per-view numbers. What would have happened had they fought? Here on the What If MMA channel, we will analyse who would have come out on top in this fantasy super fight. Before you watch the rest of the video, we would massively appreciate if you could leave a like and subscribe and even share the video to help us grow the channel. Before we look at their respective game plans, we will briefly review the tale of the tape. The fight would be contested at heavyweight. Both men were relatively small heavyweights, as evidenced by Randy being able to comfortably cut to light heavyweight. Couture was an inch taller, although Fedor offset this with his 1-inch reach advantage. Fedor was the heavier man, consistently weighing in at the 235-pound mark, give or take a couple of pounds. In comparison, Couture weighed 228 pounds for his title defense against Gonzaga. However, Randy was visibly the leaner athlete, as Fedor carried more weight in his midsection and hips. For all intents and purposes, both men were essentially the same size, with neither possessing a significant physical advantage over the other. Next, we must establish the rules of engagement. The pertinent question here is, should the fight take place in the cage or the ring? For the purposes of allowing both fighters to access their full repertoire of skills, we will analyse this fight within the context of the cage. Randy did have experience fighting in both arenas, although the cage opens up more facets to Couture's clinch and fence wrestling game, which we will discuss later in the video. Fedor would possess the clear advantage in a ring, although we believe that the cage would not deny access to his full skill set in the same way. We now move on to looking at the game plans for each fighter. We will start by reviewing Couture's strategy. Throughout the course of his career, the Natural's prime directive was to tie up his opponents and grind them down. He forced clinches to either implement his unique brand of dirty boxing or score takedowns against the fence, where he would administer punishing ground and pound. There is nothing to suggest that he would fight differently against Fedor. For Emelianenko, it is slightly harder to define his game plan. Even today, you'd be hard-pressed to find a heavyweight fighter as well-rounded as the last emperor. Fedor could do it all. He could play Jiu-Jitsu with dangerous submission fighters, he could outstrike K1 champions on the feet, and he could take down seasoned wrestlers and judoka. Early in his career, this often resulted in fluid game plans, reacting in the moment to his opponent's actions. Despite his well-roundedness, it was clear by 2008 that Fedor had a preference in how he went about winning fights. His main MO was to create space and movement on the feet to land his concussive punches. When he landed flush, he often knocked out his foes, or at the very least, hurt them enough to finish the fight soon after. If he missed his punches, he would use the momentum to collide with his opponents to set up takedowns. Regarding ground combat, Fedor was opportunistic. He would swarm his opponents with vicious ground and pound if he found himself on top, and sought upper body submissions if put on his back. Simply put, this would be a battle to control range. For this fight, Emelianenko wants to maintain distance and space to generate explosive movement, whilst the pressure fighter in Couture wants to crowd his opponent and engage in clinch fighting. These game plans will contextualize the striking, wrestling and jiu-jitsu segments of the fight. In assessing how the striking could play out, we will try to answer a series of key questions. First question to ask is, how could Couture force clinches to administer his dirty boxing? Couture would work behind his lead hand to close the distance and enter clinches. Offensively, Randy liked to lead with his left hook or incorporate it into combinations to grab the collar tie, as he did against Jeremy Horn in rings. He also threw an overhand right followed by a shift step to move in and clinch with his left hand, as he demonstrated in his entertaining bout with Nogueira at UFC 102. Defensively, Couture was willing to pressure his way into the pocket and slip or parry his opponent's strikes before countering with his own left hook to grab the collar tie, as he showed in his title defense against Gonzaga. Sometimes, the act of slipping a strike alone would allow him to clinch if his opponent overcommitted with their own punches. Once Couture tied up with his opponents, he punished them with his dirty boxing. The sight of Randy brutalizing the 20-year-old undefeated phenom Vitor Belfort with uppercuts at UFC 15 is iconic in MMA history. He was active with hand fighting to maintain the clinch, alternating between collar ties and underhooks, all the while delivering vicious uppercuts and short hooks with his free hand. If he had his foe against the cage, he delivered energy-sapping knees to the legs and body. He continually kept his opponents guessing as to which strike he would throw next. Randy's effectiveness in tiring and damaging his adversaries from the clinch would be a major concern for Fedor, particularly since he was vulnerable to cuts throughout his career. However, with his judo and sambo background, Emelianenko was no stranger to clinch fighting. Conceding underhooks or double underhooks rarely concerned him, as he would typically grab a whizzer to set up his own throws, or, in the worst case, off-balance his opponent to break out of a clinch. Fedor also used Diashi foot sweeps to escape clinches, as shown against Mirko Cro Cop. Therefore, we will conclude that whilst Randy would be able to enter clinches against Fedor, he would struggle to keep him there for long enough to accumulate fight-ending damage. The next question to ask is, how could Emelianenko land his own punches against Couture? As previously mentioned in the game plan section, Fedor would look to land his big right hand at every opportunity. He was incredibly fast and loose for a heavyweight, and the speed at which he darted into range frequently caught his opponents by surprise. Perhaps the most iconic example of this was Fedor knocking out Brett Rogers in Strikeforce with a picture-perfect overhand right. He would also follow up with a lightning-quick leaping long left hook, which he famously used to stun Tim Sylvia in their short-lived bout. However, we already established that Couture's intent would be to get in Emelianenko's grill and deny him the space required to land his power punches. Hence, how would Fedor deal with Randy's relentless pressure? The Last Emperor was very dangerous when crowded and would counter-strike with the ferocity of a wounded animal. His wild, rapid counters have changed the course of many fights for Fedor, including his knockouts of former UFC champions Andrei Arlovski and Frank Mir, and most recently Tim Johnson in Bellator. Therefore, Couture would have to proceed with extreme caution when endeavouring to dirty box with Emelianenko. The last question to ask in this striking section is, what impact could Fedor's powerful kicks have in the fight? The short answer is that his kicks would be unlikely to play a significant role in this matchup. Emelianenko undoubtedly had powerful kicks from time spent training in the Dutch kickboxing style. However, outside of using low and body kicks against Mirko Cro Cop, he largely neglected them thereafter. Ultimately, the real risk for Fedor of potentially conceding takedowns from good wrestlers catching his kicks would act as a deterrent to use them. We will now move on to analysing the wrestling. In judging how the wrestling might have played out, the first question to ask is, how could Couture take down Emelianenko? We mentioned previously in the striking section how Randy used offensive and defensive boxing to enter clinches. Couture would use these tie-ups to drive his opponents into the fence and draw on his Greco-Roman background to dump them to the mat. The natural varied his takedowns depending on the type of clinch that he could obtain. If he had higher underhooks, he commonly used Ouchigari-style inside trips, as demonstrated against Josh Barnett and fellow wrestlers Kevin Randleman and Tito Ortiz. Over-underbody locks led to step-around twisting takedowns. This was the main takedown he used to ground Mark the Hammer Coleman in their light heavyweight fights at UFC 109. Lastly, he would drop levels to link hands around his opponent's hips or legs before hoisting them up in the air with a double leg or high crotch. Randy slammed Chuck Liddell and Gabriel Gonzaga to the mat with these very methods. Now we understand the ways in which Randy could take down Fedor, we must next ask, how could Fedor stop Randy's takedowns and counter with his own throws? We identified earlier Fedor's bad habit of conceding single and double underhooks. Wrestlers like Mark Coleman, Matt Linland and Kazuyuki Fujita easily established these grips on him, as well as novice grapplers like Brett Rogers and Mark Hunt. In these situations, he usually locked up a whizzer to initiate ukigoshi, uchimata or ouchigari throws to land on top. He executed this against Matt Linland, an Olympic silver medalist freestyle wrestler in the Bodog fight promotion, although he did illegally grab the ropes to set it up. However, counter throws against accomplished wrestlers were the exception rather than the rule for Emelianenko. He was easily taken down by Coleman in their first fight and suplexed onto his head by Kevin Randleman in the Pride Heavyweight Grand Prix. One would conclude that he would struggle to stay on his feet once a skilled and intelligent wrestler like Couture ensnared him in a clinch. With that being said, the last emperor had other solutions if put on his back that we will explore soon in the Jiu-Jitsu section. Whilst it would not be part of his core game plan, we have to ask whether Fedor would use his striking to set up his own takedowns. By committing with his overhand right, Fedor knew that he could collide forcefully with his opponent if he failed to land it. When this occurred, he could clinch on his own terms and use hip throws and trips to take the fight to the mat, as he exhibited beautifully against Nogueira in their final fight. However, Emelianenko would be less likely to do this against a good wrestler like Couture, preferring to step back into his striking range. We now move on to the Jiu-Jitsu and ground portion of the fight. We have already referenced options Fedor had off his back, and so we ask, how might Fedor submit Randy from the bottom position? The simple answer is via armbar from guard. Emelianenko possessed a nasty armbar from his closed guard that he threw up fast and loose as soon as he had isolated and controlled a limb. He armbarred Coleman twice, as well as Matt Linland and the giant Hong Man Choi. Fedor's effectiveness with his submission could likely be attributed to his experience competing under the Combat Sambo rule set, where fighters only have a very short period of groundwork time to submit each other before they are stood back up. Couture had been caught earlier in his career by Enson Inoue with the exact same armbar, so he would have to tread very carefully in Emelianenko's guard. Since we have defined that Couture was far more likely to end up in the top position on the mat, we have to explore the question, how could Randy keep Fedor on his back to deliver ground and pound? One way in which Randy could mitigate the threat of Fedor's armbar would be to squash the Russian into the cage. This would kill the necessary hip movement required for Emelianenko to execute the armbar. From this position, Couture could feed Emelianenko with a sustained diet of punches and elbows. His ground and pound became even more effective when he advanced position past his foe's legs. Randy forced a referee stoppage against Gonzaga with strikes from top half guard and finished Randleman and Liddell from mount. Whilst Emelianenko offered a real submission threat from his guard, he was much less intimidating from bottom half guard. Furthermore, in later fights, when he was taken down in a cage, he never displayed an ability to cage walk to return to his feet. With this in mind, how might Fedor return to his feet if he was taken down by Randy? The last emperor was Houdini-like in escaping bad positions. When he found himself in inferior positions, he would wait for his opponent to advance to a better position, like mount, and in the transition, explosively escape to top position or back to his feet. He freed himself from bad spots like Nogueira and Randleman's side control and Coleman's back control by timing these explosive movements. Emelianenko would seek to employ the same tactic against Couture. Taking this into consideration, it would be in Couture's best interest to stay in top half guard if possible and restrict Fedor's movement. The last question to examine is, how could Emelianenko inflict damage on Couture with his own ground and pound? If Fedor found himself in the top position, whether that be from a reversal, sweep, or a takedown, then this would be perilous for Randy. Emelianenko possessed the most fearsome ground and pound seen in MMA at that point. He winged vicious, wide, leaping hooks at his opponent's head from kneeling or standing. Fedor never let up with strikes as he cycled through different positions, swarming his adversaries to inflict maximum damage. One should look at his fights against Heath Herring and Nogueira to see the best examples of this. Hence, the simple answer is that Fedor could inflict fight-ending damage with his ground and pound against Randy. Couture would have to try to weather the storm and return to his feet as quickly as possible. And if Fedor ended on top of Randy following a knockdown on the feet, given the last emperor's killer instinct, we believe that this would very likely result in a fight-ending sequence. Drawing to a close ahead of our conclusion, we will now briefly look at other factors. First, we will look at cardio. A strong gas tank was one of Randy's best attributes, and he often won by fatiguing his foes. For Emelianenko, when he had to gut out hard-fought decisions, his engine never failed him. Therefore, we conclude that cardio would not have a meaningful impact in the fight. Next, we will review each fighter's respective firepower. Emelianenko had dynamite in both hands. He knocked down many fighters with punches throughout his career. In contrast, Couture only scored one knockdown in his entire career against Tim Sylvia. Randy did have many TKO wins on his record, although these all came from an accumulation of strikes. Fedor would therefore be the more likely to end the fight by knockout. heart or intestinal fortitude is the last factor to review. Both fighters unquestionably had no quit in them. Emelianenko won many fights from losing positions, and Couture overcame age and physical disadvantages too many times to count. This contest would go on until one man was no longer standing or forced to quit from a broken limb. Considering all the factors, we will now draw a conclusion as to who we believe wins this super fight. It's our view that this would be a competitive fight until it wasn't. Randy would have good moments in the fight. We could envisage him successfully imposing his clinch boxing and scoring takedowns on the Last Emperor to control short periods of the bout. However, we don't think that Couture could either finish the fight by knockout or keep Emelianenko grounded for the whole fight due to Fedor's legitimate submission threat and ability to create scrambles to return to standing. We've yet to mention it, but Couture even fighting at the highest level, well into his 40s, was a feat in itself. However, we feel that the 13-year age gap would have an influence on the outcome of this fight. Eventually, the younger and faster Fedor would catch Randy with a big punch that would either turn out his lights there and then, or allow the Russian to pounce for the TKO finish. We therefore favour Emelianenko to win 8 times out of 10. Couture would have to either fight the perfect fight or inflict a fight-ending cut. With that being said, our verdict is that Emelianenko would win via TKO in round 2 after potentially dropping the first round to the natural. Do you agree or disagree with our pick? Please let us know in the comments. We make these videos to encourage debate and discussion, and please like and subscribe to see us break down more fantasy matchups in future.